Color is, without a doubt, the biggest factor when it comes to real estate photography, and it goes way beyond just adjusting white balance with temp and tint sliders. So what I want to do in this episode is I want to cover the color theory that applies to real estate photography so that you can capture and edit extremely high quality photos. Now, there's a lot that we can talk about when it comes to color theory, so I'm going to keep it simple though in this episode on the points that are most salient to doing real estate photography. And a great place to start to set the stage for all this is with this diagram. This is known as the corn sweet effect, and it's named after the scientist that discovered it, and it was published, this particular diagram, in the journal Neuroscience back in 1999. You may have seen this before, and if you haven't, this is really interesting that we've got a dark green square up here, and we've got a light green square down here, and you can see other squares throughout here. But this is an illusion. This isn't real. If we take the marquee tool here in Photoshop, and I'm going to sample this entire area here, and I'm just going to copy and then paste that. If I move that around, you can see that sure enough, we've got this circle of this green color no matter where we put it until we start sliding it down here. And once we get into that lighter green, you can see that it disappears. And why? That's because this color down here is the exact same color as this up here. This is an optical illusion, thinking that these are two different colors, but in fact, they are exactly the same color. And this is setting the stage then for how the color science and color theory then affects what we do with real estate photography, because the effect here, this illusion, is being caused not just by color, it's also being caused by the amount of light, the shadow, and the gradient in between. And on top of that, to make that illusion even worse, is that each of us has a different perception of what color is and also on light. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about how this affects the different colors that we're going to be detecting and then editing as we go through our real estate photos. But an important aspect to remember here is that if we're each seeing different colors, then what really is true white balance? Here's a little experiment you can run anytime. It's best to do this at night though when the lights are very dim. Take out a book, some type of white sheet of paper, and while it's very dim when your eyes, your pupils are going to be dilated a little bit more than usual, just cover up one eye, then the next. Go like this, and you'll probably see that your color temperature is going to vary. And if it doesn't, that's okay, but it's very common in human vision to actually have slightly different colors in one eye compared to the other. We're not manufactured robots, we're biological entities. And just like a rose bush will have no two roses exactly alike coming off of the same bush, the same goes for our eyes, and that each one is just a little bit different. That brings us up to the next point when we started talking about this corn sweet illusion and talking about how we're seeing light, is that we're so often deceived by just what we do with white balance. But white balance is such a small portion of color when we're adjusting it, especially when it comes to real estate photography. And this chromaticity diagram illustrates that very well. Now, don't let this intimidate you with all these numbers. You may have seen diagrams like this if you were ever shopping for a color monitor. What this is, this particular chromaticity diagram, it basically shows what a normal human can see, the various ranges of color. Now, I go into greater detail about this chromaticity diagram and how that relates to a lot of other various factors in my book, Mastering Color in Photography. Here, though, we're going to just scratch the surface on this, on really how it just applies to real estate photography. But notice here that we've got a lot more green, different shades of green here than we do any other colors. And that's because humans see more shades of green than any other color, which is ironic because reds will really have an impact later as we talk about how this affects saturation. But this is why when we take a look at a camera sensor, for every pixel that's shown here, we have only one red, one blue, but two green photo sites for every single pixel. That's because cameras, our digital cameras, take into account more shades of green than they do red and blue because of how humans perceive color. And that's why we have all these various shades up here. Now, we'll revisit this chromaticity diagram a little later, but the take-home point here is that no matter what, these color diagrams show us, there are still limits to how these colors are perceived by us compared to the detection of our cameras, which are two completely different things. And that big difference is by something known as color constancy. So while cameras can detect light and they can record the color out of that light, our eyes are also receptors of light, but that's not what we see. What we see is actually created by our brains, and our brains have a way of automatically adjusting white balance, so to speak, so that we see colors the proper way and we have a constancy of color, especially for anything that's white. In fact, the way that our minds actually see colors is done in a three-step process. And that is all based on what our minds think colors should be, with the first thing being that our minds will account for the entirety of a scene, not individual pixels, and thus our minds will discount inconsistent colors. Second, our brain then compares colors from other nearby objects, causing what we also saw with that corn sweet illusion. But more importantly is this third item, and somewhat disturbingly is that our perception of colors relies on our memory and expectations, what our mind knows or thinks it knows what a color should be. So everything we see is an illusion, and color plays a big part of that. But this illusion becomes even more exaggerated when we take a look at doing interior real estate photography. Let's take this kitchen shot for example. Now this was a flambient shot that was done using flash. If we take a look at just the ambient light, this is what it looked like. Now this is not what it looked like in person because of color constancy. With color constancy, it does look like this because we see whites as they should be. That's because of those three steps of the illusion of color constancy that our mind tricks us into believing that these are the proper colors, but this is then how it's actually detected by a camera, which doesn't have the intelligence of the human brain. When we go in here and look at the colors, we can see how they change up here, for instance, under the histogram, where up here we're seeing a lot of greens, we're seeing a lot of reds, and we move around here and those colors will change. So there's quite a mess of colors from different sources. We have greens that are coming in from the outside, we have yellowish bulbs that are up here that are casting light down here, and then we've got various issues with shadow. So instead, flambient corrects all that because what we do is we knock out that ambient light and then we start flashing to bring light in. And so for instance, here was a composite where I did flash on this side, I did flash on the other side, I'm able to mix in some ambient light, and then I get this final product, which is far better than trying to deal with just an ambient shot. Even if you had an HDR bracket of ambient shots like this, you're going to be dealing with color, and it isn't a matter of white balance. You can see this is auto white balance. It's not that. What it is, it's all the various sources of color and each one has a different color temperature. So you can't get just one single white balance in a case like this unless you introduce flash, which then takes out all the ambient light and then you only use one light source. Now, if you're not familiar with doing the flambient technique, I would invite you to take a look at my course on doing pro interior photography. I've got a variety of courses on doing professional real estate photography, and I've got links to all that down in the description of this video. And this is why we don't want to rely on just our temp and tint sliders. Now, it's very important to get a white balance that's very close if we have other color corrections that we need to take into account, which we'll start stepping through here in this video. But the most important thing to remember here is that it's not just about also the temperature. It's not just about all the temperature that's coming off those various lights and those sources. There's other things that we need to take into consideration as we're taking our photos and editing them. And the biggest thing on that, when we go back to this chromaticity diagram to see all the colors that the human eye sees, is that it's not just about these colors, it's also about tint. So you can see here, this is where across this little arc, we would be adjusting white balance. You can see that it's very warm over here in the low numbers and very cool once we get into the high numbers. But when we go back and forth between green and we go between magenta, that's when we're adjusting tint. And this applies then to when we do our white balance adjustments, that we have to take both color temperature and tint into account. And one of the big things here that we can see, and I'll demonstrate, is that as we were to cool a temperature, we have to take into consideration what that means from going from green into magenta. Let's use this as a great example. Now, this is a finished shot doing flambient and also a window pull just to get rid of some of the reflections that were in the glass. But when we take a look at what was involved here, we can see that if we took an ambient shot, there's a lot of issues here. It's not just in color, other stuff that then flash will take care of. But this doesn't have the right colors to it. We can see that something's off. Now, I set my camera's white balance to 4600 and the tint was automatically set by the camera at 14 because, as you know, you can adjust and tweak the tint if you really get into the menu system, but there really is, when white balance is considered, it's just a temp adjustment. Now, I could go in here and I could say, let's do an auto adjustment, and sure enough, as it lowered that color temperature, the tint went down as well. Once again, if we take a look at before, it was at 4614, and then with an auto adjustment, it went down to 4001. That was a huge difference. But it also goes beyond this. This is then a global change of temperature and tint, but as we know, that's not always going to be the case. For instance, when we take a look at doing the flambient blending portion of it, you can see I've desaturated the ceiling up here so I can just get rid of those colors. I know that that was going to be a white ceiling, but the rest of this is suffering. Now, I could do the auto white balance adjustment, but let's take a look at this in a more adjusted method across the entire tonal range. So let's take a look at our flash shot, which is down here. We can see all those red colors. If I were to go above that layer and I were to put in a curves adjustment layer by going to layer and then to adjustment layer and then to curves, I can make an adjustment easily and automatically across the entire tonal range. And the way that I would do that, and something that I show in like my expert editing course, is you could go up here to the hamburger menu and you could go to your auto options. And in there, usually using fine dark and light colors with a snap to neutral midtones, those two adjustments you can see then took care of adjusting the color across the tonal range. But you'll notice here that it wasn't one completely straight line going across our reds or going across our blues. That's because this adjusted the color across the entire tonal range, not just globally with sliders. And by the way, if you didn't like this much adjustment to it, you can just change that layer's opacity. One of the tricks that I also show in my course on expert editing. But here we've got a different case, and it's not just about some type of temperature and tint that needs to just be adjusted across the tonal range. There are other issues of color cast in particular coming off this carpet that has a lot of red in it. Now, red is going to be something we're going to talk about here coming up, and it's very important when you're making some of these adjustments. But first, just in general, you can see there's not just color casts coming from red that are hitting the ceiling. We can also see that coming from these lights. If you wanted to see that, you could take, for instance, your saturation slider and move that all the way up and you start seeing those colors. Same with moving your vibrance up. You can see just temporarily where these color casts are coming from. We'll just reset that back down here and take a look then at how we might adjust this. So this looks good so far. If we take a look though at the flash shot for it, we can see that looks a lot cleaner than if we were just use, for instance, the ambient shot. But there's still some color issues that are going on here. And there are automatic ways to actually correct the color, just like I did with the curves layer. Now, you could do that also in this case, but one thing that's also really smart about Photoshop that's so often overlooked is that we can do this automatically without having to use, for instance, Adobe Camera Raw or curves or anything else. I'm just going to take that flash layer, which is this layer right here. I'm going to take that and duplicate it by doing Control J, and then I'm just going to go up to Image and then to Auto Color. You can see it automatically adjusted those colors. So we can see that this is with it, this is before, with it, and before. And if we were to then take a look at the effect that this had, we could do that by putting in a new adjustment layer, which would take care of, for instance, our saturation, just to do this test. So if we did this and put the saturation up to 100%, we can see where some of the offending colors are coming from. Right now, we're looking at the colors that would be exaggerated from our adjusted layer, but before we did that, this is what we had. And now we can see why there was so many reds that were really across that ceiling and other areas of the room that were corrected then to a large degree once we did then that automatic adjustment. This leads us now into the next big aspect of color theory when it applies to real estate photography, and that's that it's not just about those mixes of reds, greens, and blues. There are three other important factors that comprise how we see color and how we adjust them when we're doing our editing. And we can see that here. It's known as the HSB model, which stands for hue, saturation, and brightness, which is something you see if you use the color picker tool in Photoshop and you have H selected. And you can see there's H, S, and B. We're used to seeing most of the time where our reds, our greens, and our blues are, but in fact, what we have is this array of saturation and brightness. So depending on the color that we pick here, which is really our hue, then we have a different amount of saturation. You can see saturation is a lot of color, less saturation, desaturation is a lot less color. But look what happens with the brightness. So we also lose color, not just from saturation, but also as we start losing brightness, our colors will change. And this here is a prime example of this, where this particular condo that I shot here a little while back, it was almost all blue. Now, this is how it looks to the human eye, and this is done with using the flambient technique. So I have some ambient light that's overlaying here, and what that is, it's overlaying on top of different amounts of light that were provided by me using flash. I started out by doing a composite. So I have a light near the camera, a light over here, no light up here yet. You can see I'm going to then composite this just like I show in my course on interior photography. And then here I add a lighten blending mode pop up here. So now I've got a good color base so that when I apply then ambient light, this happens to be at 50% luminance, then I've got luminance here from an ambient shot, and I don't have then any color because it's in luminosity blending mode. Okay, now let's take a look though if I were to add 100% luminance, and that's what this layer is here. Okay, so I can see my colors, but this will change if I were to only use one flash. So using just one flash here, we can see that it's much darker way back here in the distance. And if I were to then turn on 100% luminance, we can see the color is going to be different. I'll zoom in here just a little bit so we can get a good idea of what's going on here. Now if I were to turn my flash shot off and go to the proper flash composites, you can see there's a change in color. We can measure that as well by going up here to the top, using our color picker tool, and we select something, let's say right about here. We can see that it is in the blues, but it is, you can see, more desaturated than if I were to use the color picker tool and select something that was then flash composited so it had more light, and we can see sure enough it is a lot more blue. There's more saturation there. So what we have is something then that when we finally do our proper flambient blending, we have something that is far more accurate color-wise than if we were to try to use one flash and try to add luminance to it that way. So it's a little bit more work, obviously, to be able to get all of our flash composites done, but this gives us then the highest degree of color when we do our flambient blending. So while brightness plays a big part for real estate photography using that HSB model, the saturation portion of the HSB model can really play some tricks on you and can be dangerous in some instances. And let's use this as a prime example in that what we have here is mostly neutral colors, but if we go in here, we can see there's some reds that are in these flowers. Now, what happens here is that reds, they're really not that well detected by the human eye as much as greens are, but they saturate first. which makes them dangerous if you're trying to adjust saturation. Now, inside, we wouldn't be adjusting saturation, if at all. But you'll see this especially on the outside. But just as an example here, watch what happens when I move the saturation slider to 100%. You can see these almost look like they're lighting up and nothing else around there is. And that's because we zoom out here, reds are saturating first. So this is how it is normally. And then at 100%, there's some saturation elsewhere, but those reds are really lighting up. Now, it's just the opposite effect if you use vibrance. While saturation works off the HSB model to saturate any color, vibrance detects muted colors and saturates those. So in other words, the non-reds. So if I move the vibrance slider up to 100%, you can see everything gets saturated heavily, except for right here, our flowers really didn't get saturated as much. Another thing too to be careful with saturation is it's not just about the vibrance and saturation sliders. And dehaze, by the way, is a type of vibrance that only really works with colors known to be atmospheric haze. Should really be only used on the outside and only in selective cases, never on the inside. But here on an interior photo, and of course it also applied to exterior photos, is how the tonal range will affect our saturation. So let's, for instance, just say that we took our blacks all the way down, we put our contrast really high and our clarity really high, and you can see immediately that our colors are changing as we're adjusting then the tonal range. Now this is very exaggerated. You can see it is very, very much different than when we originally started. So by adjusting the tonal range, we're adjusting the colors, which is why you need to be careful, for instance, on how much blacks you put in when you're doing interior photography. Sure, you'd like to darken up the woods and a few things like that, but if you go too far, you can see it doesn't just darken everything, it actually changes the color of a lot of these items. The last issue that I'd like to talk about when it comes to color theory and real estate photography is the color space. Now, this is often confused because if you're coming from other photography backgrounds, for instance, doing wildlife, you're doing landscape photography, you may be using a very broad color space, but it's very limited when it comes to real estate photography, and here's why. Taking a look at another chromaticity diagram here, we can see a more confusing view. Don't worry, this is actually pretty simple in that we have two main color spaces that we want to pay attention to here. One is sRGB here, the other is Adobe RGB 1998. Now, sRGB, that's this area you can see that's kind of in this little outline here. It really doesn't cover very much of the entire gamut of color that the human eye can see, but in most cases, it really does more than enough. In fact, sRGB is the recommended color space for doing real estate photography because this is the standard that is used across the internet, and it's the standard then that you'll be having your customers' photos delivered in that will be seen across the internet. Now, if you are printing something of extremely high color, some of your landscape and wildlife, you may want to go to Adobe RGB 1998. But you also have to find a print house that can do that because most print houses just print in sRGB. And if you've ever seen any of my work, well, it's all in sRGB. It's not in RGB 1998. I don't really find a need for it, but most importantly is that when you're doing real estate photography, it should be in sRGB. And what that means then is that you need to have sRGB set across the board. You need to have sRGB set in your camera, in your monitor, in your working space in Photoshop, and also in Lightroom Classic for external editing and export, for instance. In Photoshop, you can find this under the Edit menu and go to Color Settings. In color settings, the working space should be set for RGB to sRGB. This IEC blah, blah, blah is just the standard sRGB. So you need to have it set in Photoshop, but in Lightroom Classic, it's a little different. Now in Lightroom Classic, all of this area that you're working in is actually in the color space known as Pro Photo RGB. And as you can see, that's the all-encompassing color space. And the reason why Lightroom Classic does this is because it says no matter what monitor I'm on, no matter what you're going to do with the photo, I'm just going to show everything. So it's deceiving, and they really should have some way of setting this. But What you do want to set in Lightroom Classic is how you deal with external editing. In other words, when you're sending these TIFF files and RAW files back and forth between Photoshop and Lightroom Classic. And to do that, you want to go to Edit and to your Preferences. And then here, you want to go to External Editing. And in External Editing, that's where you would be selecting. It's going to go by default to Photoshop 2025. TIFF is the file format between sending all these back and forth, and the color space should be set to sRGB. Now there are some other things here too that are important. 16-bit is what you want. Even though you'll be exporting JPEGs and they'll be 8-bit, you want to work in 16-bit color. That's very common. It makes big TIFF files, but you'll have the best colors out of that. And then for the compression, make sure this is set to none. By default, they used to set it to zip, and that was really unnecessary and it took forever to transfer files. But the big take-home point here, when it comes to color space, is that it's for, in Lightroom Classic, external editing, and the color space should be set here as sRGB. But don't forget also that when you're exporting these files from Lightroom Classic and you're making JPEGs, to also set that. For instance, when you go to File, and you go then to Export, and in the Export dialog, when you're selecting JPEG, make sure that the color space is set to sRGB. But all of this just scratches the surface when it comes to color theory. Now, these are some of the basics when it comes to doing real estate photography that will help you get better photos. But if you'd like to learn more about real estate photography editing in general, a lot of these things are also covered intermixed throughout my various courses on real estate photography. And of course, if you really want to dig deep into color theory just in photography in general, then check out my book, Mastering Color in Photography. And as always, if you have a comment or you'd like to see more tutorials on a specific subject, just leave me a comment below.